When you think of the dog days of summer, July weather is probably what comes to mind, and the data does show that we are in the heart of the hottest days and also the muggiest of the summer season. Meteorologist John Burchfield here with this week's edition of the Climate Friday newsletter. We're going to be talking about the hottest days of summer that just so happen to line up with mid to late July and what the data shows for how weather is getting hotter, and in part that is due to climate change. So if you're not already subscribed, head to WTOL.com/email, and we're going to break down the data on the hottest summer days, just how high the thermometer is climbing, and what you can expect as we head towards the final month of the summer season. Now, when you think of the average high temperature for this time of year, it actually peaks out at 87 degrees now, and that hottest stretch, that occurs starting on 4th of July, Independence Day, and continuing through the 22nd. So we have that stretch that is statistically our hottest stretch of the summer season. Now, you may find it hard to believe that our normal high gets close to 90 degrees, and that is something that's a relatively new occurrence. In fact, comparing our climate data now to just a decade ago, that average high of 87 used to be 2 degrees lower at about 85. In the last 10 years, we have seen a 2-degree uptick in the average summer high temperature locally. Now, when you go back even further, data from NOAA going back to 1970 shows that that average summertime temperature has risen 4 degrees during that time period of about half a century. So it's even more notable when you go back 50 years. And of course, there is year-to-year variability. There are some anomalies in extreme years, for instance, 1988 on that scale. However, overall, that line of best fit shows you things are getting warmer, especially during the summertime. Now, there's some very real and tangible impacts that you may have experienced personally during the summertime months. Heat-related illness is more of a concern when you get these hot and humid days, especially when our average high tops out at 87. When you get up to the 90s and even triple digits, heat stroke and heat exhaustion become more prevalent. Additionally, the soil becomes drier because drought becomes a little more frequent and also longer in duration. Now, there's a twofold impact because while we do see drought more commonly now, we also see heavy precip and flooding rain, as we talked about in last week's edition with some of the flooding that occurred down in Texas. So there's a twofold impact: more drought, but also heavier rain. And drought, unfortunately, predisposes the soil to flooding. And when the soil is dry and cracked, it really does not sop up that moisture like a sponge, and flooding can become more pronounced. So how has climate change affected our temperatures? I want to look at the data over the last decade alone, and I've highlighted in orange the summertime months. Now, the year starts off with January. We've seen a 2-degree rise in January temperatures, 1.6 in February and March. Not a ton of warming comparatively in April, but then as you head towards May, June, July, and August, an average temperature has increased by over 2 degrees. In September and October, it's been even more notable, not quite as much in November, and December is the month that is statistically warmed the most purely in the last decade. Now, this is a trend that has been uniform across the United States. It's not just Toledo, not just Southeast Michigan and Northwest Ohio. Data from Climate Central shows that 97% of American cities with weather observation sites have warmed up since 1970. That is not surprising in the least, but the magnitude of warming may surprise you. The average U.S. city is warmed up by 2.6 degrees in that last half-century time frame. So it goes to show that the Toledo area has actually warmed up by more than the national average. So what about the numbers for this summer in particular, and how do we stack up to past years? Well, so far this July has already delivered 6 90-degree days, and that is much more than last July. We only had 2 during the entire month of July. And of course, we still have a couple weeks left of this month, and that tally, it is likely to grow. When you see that WTOL 11 weather forecast, you are going to see the return of some 90s in this forecast. What about June? We had 8 90s, including 7 consecutive 90-degree days during the month of June, and the data is actually remarkably similar comparing June of 2025 to June of 2024. We also had 8 90s and ironically a stretch of 7 consecutive. Now, we did have a hotter day, purely looking at that magnitude of peak heat where we hit 99 last June, but the 8 90-degree days is something that is consistent in the last couple of June. That June stretch this year in particular was from the 21st through the 27th, and 7 of our 8 90s, they occurred during that stretch. Toledo has gone historically up to 11 days of straight 90s, and that is the record longest stretch. So you may be wondering what exactly defines or constitutes a heat wave. And there isn't necessarily an exact definition, but heat wave generally describes abnormally hot and humid weather, and it lasts at least 2 days. So there has to be some sort of duration element. In other words, you can't just have a few hours or 1 day of heat. It has to last at the bare minimum 2 days, and abnormally hot and humid is relative to the area that you're forecasting for. For instance, a heat wave in Michigan and Ohio, a little bit different from Texas and Arizona, and a heat wave can occur anywhere with above average temperatures, and heat stroke, heat-related illness, and other medical conditions become more prevalent when that heat rises, and that is something that climate change has caused. Now, the heat has been prevalent and notable this summer. In fact, you may have noticed July feeling hotter and muggier than it did last year. So far, July is 1.6 degrees above average, and that is our monthly temperature compared to normal. Now, it is likely that with the way the forecast is trending, we're actually going to get even a little bit hotter over the final weeks of the month. June was 1.2 degrees above average, which is to say, still notably above average, but a little bit closer to that normal threshold than what we've experienced so far this month. So are you looking forward to some less humid conditions? The weather changes very quickly this time of year. Our average high is still at 87 degrees. Perhaps you're watching this on Friday. Yep, we are officially still in the dog days of summer. Now, 1 month from now, on August 18th, we drop down to 84 degrees. So August statistically does feature a dropping thermometer, as July is our hottest month of the calendar year. So how do our average highs compare on a month-by-month basis? Well, June kicks off the summer season with an average of 83. July, there's that peak of summer heat at 87. August is still warmer than June on average, but does feature a notable drop, especially in the second half of the month. September, as we officially kick off the fall season, still features that nice happy medium with an average high of 78 degrees. We drop down to the 60s by October and the 50s in November. Now, one other notable feature you've probably noticed this month, not only the summer daytime highs, but those overnight lows. Even first thing in the morning as you're waking up, heading out the door, heading to work or going on that walk, it is already very swampy to start the day. During June, our average morning low is 61. Not too bad, right? What about July? 64 degrees. And in fact, this is one of the things climate change is affecting the most, is those overnight lows. You've likely noticed there's some mornings where it's already in the 70s when you wake up, and that is a trend that's becoming more common. August features an average low of 63, and September is really when we flip that switch and the lows drop down into the 50s. October, we drop down to the 40s. In November, boy, some sharp changes in the weather ahead. Now, with the changing weather, of course, you'll want to be subscribed to that Climate Friday newsletter. WTOL.com/email is the place to go. You can watch on YouTube, and also WTOL 11 Plus streaming on your schedule. We'll have new content sent straight to your inbox every week. We'll see you next Friday.